Welcome to the Arts at ODU Summer Series. I'm Cullen Strawn, Executive Director for the Arts at Old Dominion University. The Summer Series was developed to facilitate community connections through free and accessible programming, to highlight the strength and resilience of the arts at ODU, and to lift spirits during this challenging time. The ODU community was invited to submit proposals for programs, and this afternoon, we continue the series by featuring 4 visual artists in a program entitled Enclosure. Sylvie Green, Christina Lorena Weisner, Heather Bryant, and Manuela Morão have explored being caught or trapped or enclosed and have made meaning from these experiences by creating art for themselves and their communities. Thank you, Sylvie, Christina, Heather, and Manuela.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sylvie Green. Thank you, ODU Arts, for hosting Enclosure. We're honored to be here. Please know that we will take questions at the end. So if anything pops into your head while you're watching, please type your question into the Q&A. Last spring, I experienced a bad breakup. I needed closure, but my former boyfriend refused to respond to any of my phone calls or text messages. He blocked me on social media. He had been a gift giver, and I began to assemble his gifts, and I talked to my artist friends about creating an art installation as a way to find closure. I began working on closure and found myself enclosed because of the pandemic and then curfews. And my work came to represent closure and enclosure in theme and in structure. I then asked Heather and Manuela and Christina if they could be inspired to create something on the theme of enclosure, and they said yes. Enclosures can be imposed upon us, or we can self-impose. We can choose to be enclosed. Relationships, in many ways, are like enclosures. I'm going to share a video with you, and I'll say a few words at the end. I want to say thank you to my friends, Matt Friedman, filmmaker, and Trent Toner, sound designer, for their help on this project. And I'll close with this. My visual art is informed by my performance art, and the process of creating art has story and character. I am a character in the story of my art, and the documentation of this process is also an art form in and of itself. Thank you for allowing me to share my artwork with you.
Thank you, Sylvie. That was wonderful. Hi, my name's Heather Bryant. I'm going to be sharing some of my sketchbook images with you today. I'm going to share my screen. So all of these images were created during the time of uncertainty around the pandemic. Making art in this enclosed space allowed me to investigate new imagery and try new materials while striving for an authentic expression. Overall, these images express different states of being while investigating form in a safe place. This also served as a visual journal for me to document my feelings. I was encouraged to slow down, think, reflect, and explore while creating from within. And I tried to have fun while doing this, even if the images were emotional or serious in nature. When I look at these images, I see figures that are hesitant, awkward, consumed, in need of comfort, but also have a whimsical quality. The materials I used were ballpoint pen, alcohol markers, watercolor, ink, and paint pen. The similarities of the visual attributes, such as texture, color, line quality, and pattern, allude to the interconnected experiences that we all share. The common experience of shelter in place and social distancing has made all of us think about the interactions, and these images are an expression of that. I've kept sketchbooks for over 10 years and look forward to continuing that practice and would encourage other artists to do the same. Thank you, Sylvie, for giving me the opportunity to share what I created with you during this time period.
Thank you, Heather. That was beautiful. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Manuela Mourão, and I'm a professor of literature at Old Dominion University. I am also a visual artist. And today I'll briefly discuss two works I created for this project, Enclosure. When Sylvie approached me about this project, my first thought was, this is very fitting. It's a wonderful topic to describe my life, because I typically end up living in a state of more or less voluntary enclosure in my studio and in my study, painting and writing. But I ended up focusing instead on the idea of involuntary enclosure that was the result of the current pandemic. Very much on my mind as I began working on the pieces I'm sharing with you today was the fact that while this enclosure is a collective experience, it can actually underscore our differences, perhaps even more so than it underscores our similarities. And this led to two questions. The first was, what about the quarantine separates us besides the physical distance imposed on us? In other words, what about the quarantine makes some of us feel isolated and lost, while others feel sheltered and safe, almost uninvolved, as it were? There's a pandemic out there, but I'll be fine. My family will be fine. I don't have to worry about it. And the second question was, can this change? In the end, I responded to the theme of enclosure with two pieces. One is an assemblage entitled Primed, and the other is a painting entitled Say Their Names. And I'm going to begin sharing with you the images. So this is a photo of Primed. For Primed, I repurposed a black metal bird cage, and I locked inside it a series of cardboard boxes from Amazon Prime, the delivery and the streaming service that we all know. The cage, of course, alludes to the literal enclosure of quarantine, its black bars evoking the sinister aspect of prison. In this case, a metaphorical prison a kind of ideological conditioning that alienates us from our communities and imprisons us in our sheltered individuality. The boxes with their famous logo, they allude specifically to the two systems that facilitate this isolation, consumerism and entertainment. Of course, each of us will think of other possible interpretations, and I don't mean to preempt any. Still, I should say that with Primed, I wanted to call attention to the insidious nature of things that have become so naturalized in our society that we have stopped questioning or even noticing them. And they can have a very detrimental impact on how we all live. And I speak for myself, really. All of the boxes that you see here are from orders that I have placed. Between having almost anything I need delivered to my door next day or so, or being able to watch a movie or a series at the click of a button, I have found it pretty easy to remain isolated, to indulge in my tendencies for seclusion, to remain more or less uninvolved. The second piece that I created for this show is this painting entitled Say Their Names. For this painting, I used oil, cold wax, and encaustic over a collage of a series of images that are about the pandemic and the social unrest that followed the murder of George Floyd by police on Memorial Day 2020. And by the way, that was the same day that the New York Times published on its front page only names of victims of the COVID-19 virus. So the painting tries to foreground how these two momentous realities, the pandemic and the protests, coincided in time, and suggests that their meanings continue to inform each other, the isolation of quarantine, broken by a tidal wave of demonstrations of solidarity against racism that are still going on. I don't really have time to talk about all of the images here, but I'll show you some close-ups of sections of the painting so we can see the George Floyd mural that I love, Black Lives Matter. This is from the New York Times page that I mentioned. And this is a photo of Martha Raddatz of active duty troops on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. In essence, these two works encapsulate my thoughts on enclosure. Primed, here shown again, draws attention to how for a segment of Americans, white, middle class, etc., systemic white privilege can alleviate some of the pressures of the involuntary enclosure that was brought by the pandemic, and therefore contribute to the complicity with the system. Whereas Say Their Names reminds us that many Black Americans experienced the involuntary enclosure of the pandemic from within another involuntary enclosure in systemic racism. But of course, the painting also chronicles both our common humanity and a movement towards solidarity and social justice, and this can give us hope. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Christina Lorena Weisner, and I'll go ahead and share my screen as well. So my work often employs found objects, scientific instrumentation, elemental materials, and I'm interested in exploring complex relationships between these objects, humans, and the natural environment. So the slide that you see here shows some recent projects, which included living in and making work about a meteorite impact crater in southern Germany and traversing the entirety of a 275-mile river from source to ocean. So when I was invited to join this group show, which began with the word enclosure, I began to think about the word as it applies specifically to land use and geography and how we draw lines on the surface of the earth. We enclose ourselves by property lines, by town, by state, by county, by country, by continent. So my project, Lines in the Sand, references geological lines drawn from my home in the Outer Banks of North Carolina to other intertidal zones that bridge the gap between land and water. The title also, however, makes reference to the geopolitical lines we draw in the sand and landscapes separating countries, states, territories, as was shown in the last slide. As the current pandemic further isolates us, as geographical lines are often used as racial and economic divides, this project strives to create newfound connections between the landscape, the individual, the general public by collaboratively creating works of art out in the open and in compliance with social distancing on public beaches that address this very unique moment in history. So it's really a two-part project. Part one includes my writing to arts councils, museums, community art programs around the world located along coastal intertidal zones. The letters request a small sample of sand from their local beach to be sent to me by mail to fill the physical lines, which you see on the slide on the right. The test tubes are sort of laid in the orientation on their sides to make that clear. It's not one continuous tube. One test tube will always contain sand from the Outer Banks, while the other tube will contain sand from the other participating art entity's local beach. Exact collection sites and locations will be documented. So as you can see, the test tubes are currently empty because I'm just in the very beginning stages of this project. Okay, so part two entails my working with each participating art entity to create a unique collaborative beach sculpture that addresses a particular idea. So that might be the two locations, their relationship, proximity, similarities, differences, etc. So for example, participants in the Outer Banks might build a semicircle facing the ocean, while participants in Cadiz, Spain, which you can see here, would do the same, simply on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. So together, creating a full circle. The sculptures will be built in the two locations and photographed on the same day from both eye level and above via drone. And I'm hoping to eventually work with 50 different locations around the world. And for me as a sculptor, the specificity and history of materials matter. The glass which contains the sand in each sculpture is self-reflexive. Both glass and sand share the same fundamental composition, silicon dioxide, however, in a different state. So glass has an internal structure that's somewhere between a liquid and a solid. And in this case, the sand is altered for human use. So test tubes are made for scientific research and speak to our complex relationship with the earth and natural materials. And then on the right, the intertidal zones between land and sea where sand is often found are also constantly shifting and changing as our continents, as are the continents on which they exist in their gradual movement across the Earth's surface through geological time. And although everything is always changing, through this pandemic, we've all become hyper aware of change as the status quo. So finally, the project will culminate in an exhibition of all of the lines and sands of the physical objects, as well as the documented sculptures and performances collectively created on the beach, in addition to the correspondence between arts councils, museums, community art centers, and all of those will be displayed in some manner. So through this work, I hope to invite the viewer to consider the deep geological time of water and the landscape, as well as the more fleeting existence of living beings through objects, technology, scientific instruments, and the process of discovery. And I hope to widen our gaze without, however, bludgeoning or delivering any final word. So in closing, granted, we enclose ourselves by the lines we draw, which separate us by town, state, county, continent, even by language, by species. It's important to remember we are also collectively enclosed by air, by the Earth's atmosphere together. And all enclosures are enclosed by wider enclosures. And can we benefit from reframing some of the unhealthy, stifling enclosures we've created? After all, ultimately, as Buckminster Fuller states, we are all astronauts on a little spaceship called Earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina, for your fascinating and thought-provoking and quite brilliant, to be frank, work. We will now respond to questions from the Q&A. Okay, this is a really great question. There are so many great questions. What I would like to do, because we have about 4 minutes, is I think that we can each take 1 minute to respond to this kind of broad question that seems to represent many of the other questions. And that broad question is, in what ways Has the pandemic and stay-at-home orders fueled your creativity? And in what ways has it dampened it? That's a big question. So we're all going to think about it for about 1 second, and then we're going to respond to it in less than a minute. I'll start. I am first and foremost a performance artist, and so I have been quite sad by the pandemic, of course, because of the closing of the theater, and it's very scary to think of the long-term effects of that closure. However, I have had the opportunity to be creative with some friends of mine on Zoom. And in that way, I feel as if the stay-at-home orders has made me more creative because it's forced me to use technology in my creativity. And it's forcing me to think of new ways to connect with an audience. And next, I will ask Heather to respond.
Well, during this time, it's been really rewarding to be able to be home and just feel meditative, thoughtful, quiet. It's given me time to think and reflect and maybe try things that I wouldn't have originally because perhaps I would have been busy doing other social things. So it's allowed me to read more, watch more documentaries, paint more. Negative effects that it has possibly had is that I really miss going to museums and traveling. That's been a big part of my life before. I did have an opportunity to go to the Chrysler recently, and that was very refreshing.
Great, thank you. Manuela, could you please respond to the question?
Sure. So for me, as I explained at the beginning of my talk, being at home enclosed is very much a practice that I'm so used to, and so the enclosure didn't change my practice too much. But I do miss going to museums, of course, being in person, have that experience of watching, seeing art. But really, what was most spurring for me to actually work on this project was the very specific cue that I was given by you. As an artist, I find that it's always like that. It's when I'm thrown a question, in the answering the question, wondering about how to answer the question, that I begin to conceive, of what the project should be like. And then it's always an interaction between question, answer, work. And as I'm, in this moment, in this movement, that's when things happen. And so the pandemic made us all be more in touch with one another. And that's probably why you asked, do you want to be part of this? This work would not have happened if you hadn't asked me. And your question or your request made me begin asking these questions. And that's how the work came out due to that, to that process. So I always need a prompt. And being a scholar, and I always try to get my artwork to be done in tandem with my scholarship. And so I always reach also for that possibility. And so it's that process: the studio, the study, the questions, the work.
Yes, I agree. The idea, the material, etc., the connection between the two, the physical and the, I guess, emotional or mental. Someone asked a question about catharsis, and I want to bring it up because, Manuela, you touched on that. In the creating of this art, I think I heard you say you did think about how you are as an artist, your historical moment, what you create, why, the idea of enclosure, and then, of course, these bigger social questions. I found my artwork to be even more cathartic than I imagined. It was actually quite difficult at times. It was very difficult. And to see love letters being burned, I thought, those are real artifacts. This isn't an actor endowing props. These are real props. Yeah. Christina, will you please respond to the question?
Yeah, so I agree with Heather in that I feel like the pandemic has forced me to turn inward. And so I've been practicing much more meditation than before and trying very hard to be in the present moment, which is made easier by being able to cross the street and go to the ocean and look at the horizon line, which was also a prompt for this piece. That's always a place where I go to think. And I would say also, I mean, the pandemic has caused me to search for social connection in new ways. So I had planned to cross the Alps on my bicycle this summer before the pandemic hit. And part of that trip was intended for me to start this project in person and collect these samples of sand. And it was always important for me to have a connection with the actual history of the location and the people that are there. And so that's changed. The format for this project has clearly changed, but I think in ways that are even more interesting. So having to sort of re-navigate that communication, and I'm excited to see what comes out of this project because of it.
So am I. And now that everyone knows who you are, they can follow you and find out exactly what happens. That's really exciting.
Yes, please share if you know other people that live in interesting intertidal zones. I'm looking to collaborate.
Great, great. Well, I love collaboration, and I am so honored that these women chose to embark on this project with me. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Manuela. Thank you, Christina. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, ODU Arts. And now here are some closing remarks from Colin Strawn.
I invite you to join us over the next few weeks as we continue presenting literary and performing arts during the remainder of the summer series. To learn more about the series and register for events, please visit oduartstix.com. That's oduartstix.com. And follow ODU Arts on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for updates. Thank you for joining us.